A country can hold some of the largest oil and gas reserves on Earth and still fail to shape the market in proportion to its geology. That is one of the stranger realities of the modern energy system. In theory, Iran and Venezuela should stand near the center of global supply. Together, they sit atop an immense share of the world's hydrocarbon wealth. In practice, much of that potential remains trapped behind sanctions, underinvestment, infrastructure limits, domestic political choices, and great power rivalry. So the question is not simply how much oil they have, it is why so much of it remains only partially available to the world, and why decisions made in Tehran and Caracas, or in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Brussels can change the future supply picture without a single new reserve ever being discovered. This is what makes Iran and Venezuela different from ordinary producers. They are not only exporters, they are reservoirs of latent power inside a tightly balanced global system. Energy markets are often explained through visible flows, tankers at sea, pipelines across borders, production quotas, export terminals, spot prices. But some of the most important forces in the system are not the barrels already moving. They are the barrels that could move under different political and financial conditions. Iran and Venezuela matter because they represent precisely that kind of unrealized capacity. They are energy powers not only in the present tense, but in the conditional tense. Iran holds one of the largest proven oil reserve bases in the world, and the second largest proven natural gas reserves. Venezuela holds the world's largest proven crude oil reserves, concentrated largely in the Orinoco Belt. On paper, that should make both countries decisive, but reserve size alone does not determine influence. The real question is how much of that geological wealth can be converted into usable output, sold into real markets, financed through real institutions, and sustained over time. That is where the story becomes less geological and more political. Because Iran and Venezuela are not simply rich in resources, they are also constrained in ways that transform energy into diplomacy, sanctions into supply management, and reserve estimates into strategic leverage. Iran's energy endowment is extraordinary. It holds roughly 208 to 209 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, placing it among the top reserve holders in the world. Its gas reserves are even more striking, around 34 trillion cubic meters, second only to Russia. That combination matters because it gives Iran long-term significance, not just in oil, but in future gas security discussions as well. Venezuela's reserve base is larger still in crude terms, more than 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the largest in the world by many current estimates. But Venezuela's wealth is not identical to Saudi Arabia's or Iraq's. Much of it is extra-heavy crude, dense, sulfur-rich, and more expensive to extract, dilute, transport, and refine. So while the reserve number is enormous, the path from underground resource to profitable export is more demanding. This distinction is important. Not all reserves are equally easy to mobilize. Some are low-cost and quickly marketable. Others require capital, technical expertise, stable policy, and reliable refining chains. Still, the central fact remains. Iran and Venezuela together represent an unusually large concentration of hydrocarbon potential, and in a world where spare supply is limited and disruption risk is constant, potential itself becomes strategic. Both countries were once more central to actual oil flows than they are today. Iran was an early major producer in the Middle East and a founding member of OPEC in 1960. It helped shape the early politics of producer sovereignty, pricing power, and national control over resources. Before the revolution of 1979, Iran was a major supplier to both Western and Asian markets. But revolution, war, sanctions, and investment limits changed that trajectory. Iranian production became more volatile, and its integration with the global system became increasingly filtered through political confrontation. Venezuela followed a different path, but reached a similar result. For parts of the 20th century, Venezuela was one of the world's leading oil exporters and another founding member of OPEC. Its state oil company, PDVSA, became central to national finances and international energy diplomacy. By the 1990s and early 2000s, Venezuela was expanding heavy oil development in the Orinoco Belt with international partners. Then came decline, political instability, underinvestment, operational deterioration, sanctions, falling output. So both countries illustrate the same broader pattern. Vast reserves do not automatically produce stable influence. That influence must be converted through institutions, finance, infrastructure, and external access. And when those channels weaken, geology remains powerful but dormant. At this point, a simple question appears. If Iran and Venezuela hold so much energy, why are they so often discussed as problems rather than as pillars pillars of supply. Because markets do not run on reserves alone, they run on the relationship between reserves and access. Access to capital, access to buyers, access to shipping, access to technology, access to payment systems, access to political permission. When those forms of access are restricted, a resource-rich state can become globally important precisely because it is underproducing. Its absence starts to matter as much as another country's presence. This is why major powers treat Iran and Venezuela as more than bilateral issues. For the United States and its allies, both countries sit at the intersection of energy strategy and broader foreign policy aims. Iranian oil is linked to regional security, sanctions policy, and non-proliferation. Venezuelan oil is tied to governance concerns, regional politics, migration pressures, and domestic debates in the Americas. But energy never disappears from the calculation. Removing Iranian or Venezuelan barrels from the market can tighten supply and support prices. Relaxing restrictions can add incremental supply when prices rise too far or when disruptions elsewhere threaten broader stability. This makes sanctions a form of adjustable market influence even when they are publicly justified on broader political grounds. For China, the logic is more transactional and structural. Iranian and Venezuelan crude often comes discounted. That matters for refiners seeking lower-cost feedstock, especially for independent operators willing to work through indirect channels. China also gains diversification. Buying sanctioned barrels can reduce dependence on US-aligned suppliers while expanding Beijing's leverage over vulnerable exporters. For Russia, the relationship is more competitive than cooperative in pure market terms. Iran, Venezuela, and Russia increasingly compete for similar buyers willing to purchase discounted crude outside the main Western system. When one sanctioned producer gains space, another may lose margin, market share, or bargaining power, so the interaction is not ideological alone. If you value calm, in-depth explanations like this, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more videos that uncover the systems shaping our world. It is a contested marketplace inside a politicized supply system. Sanctions are often described as punishments. In energy terms, they also function as supply architecture. They do not simply say no, they shape how much oil enters the market, where it goes, at what discount, through which ships, under what legal risk, and with what financing. In Iran's case, sanctions since the mid-2000s have periodically restricted access to buyers, insurers, tankers, finance, and upstream technology. That has likely kept exports well below what unconstrained capacity might otherwise have allowed. Yet Iran did not disappear from the market. It adapted, discounted crude, opaque routing, ship-to-ship transfers, complex paperwork, intermediaries, non-Western channels. What emerged was not isolation, but partial reintegration through unofficial pathways. Venezuela faced a similar, though not identical, pattern. Sanctions on its oil sector limited exports, investment, and access to the diluents and technology needed to process extra heavy crude efficiently. Since heavy oil production is technically more demanding, these restrictions often carried especially sharp consequences. The result in both cases is a stop-go system. Tighter enforcement removes or suppresses supply. Partial easing brings some of it back. Markets learn to watch not only geology and demand, but enforcement intensity, licensing windows, and diplomatic signals. This turns Tehran and Caracas into conditional producers, important not because the market always counts on them, but because the market cannot ignore them. The modern energy system increasingly contains two overlapping maps. The formal map is visible: official exports, recognized contracts, major benchmark prices, public shipping records. The second map is harder to see: discounted cargoes, older tankers, ship-to-ship transfers, blended crude streams, non-transparent ownership, indirect financial settlement. Iran and Venezuela occupy both maps, but the second has become more important under sanctions. China has emerged as the primary buyer of much of this discounted supply, particularly through channels less exposed to Western enforcement. This is not just opportunistic purchasing, it is also strategic positioning. By absorbing sanctioned barrels, China strengthens its supply flexibility while deepening the dependence of sellers who have fewer other outlets. Venezuela adds another layer because China has significant financial exposure there through loans and investments tied to oil. That means Beijing is not just a customer, it is also a creditor with an interest in Venezuela's production productive recovery. Russia complicates the picture further. After Western sanctions on Russian oil in 2022, Russian barrels increasingly entered the same discounted marketplace, competing with Iranian and Venezuelan supply for buyers in Asia. This did not create a unified anti-Western energy bloc in any simple sense. It created competitive congestion among sanctioned exporters. The shadow market, in other words, is not a parallel utopia. It is a crowded and risky arena where discount, access, and political shelter determine who can keep selling. So are Iran and Venezuela important because they are producing a lot today, or because they could produce much more tomorrow? The answer is both, but the second matters more. Their real strategic weight lies in the gap between what exists underground and what reaches the water. That gap is where sanctions operate. That gap is where investment decisions matter. That gap is where major powers gain leverage. And that gap is where future supply shocks can be managed or worsened. Influence over Iran's and Venezuela's output matters because global oil markets are often tighter than they appear. Spare capacity is limited. New large-scale supply takes time. Unexpected disruptions happen often. In that context, countries with very large reserve bases and suppressed output become strategically valuable. If war in the Gulf removes barrels from the market, easing restrictions on Iran may suddenly look more attractive. If heavy crude supply tightens and refining systems need that grade of oil, Venezuela becomes harder to dismiss. If OPEC or OPEC Plus tries to manage price bands, the unrealized capacity of both countries shapes expectations about what the group can eventually bring back. So influence here does not mean direct control in the old imperial sense. It means power over timing, power over when barrels are allowed to matter, power over whether investment can return, power over whether reserves remain idle, partially mobilized, or more fully reactivated. This is why major powers do not treat these countries as marginal outliers. They treat them as adjustable variables in a wider equation of supply, inflation, alliances, and strategic competition. There are several ways to interpret this pattern. One view argues that sanctions on Iran and Venezuela are mainly about oil and market leverage. Another argues that energy is only one layer within a broader agenda involving security, regime behavior, regional influence, and political values. The reality is usually more mixed than either side admits. Energy does not explain everything, but it limits what policymakers are willing to do. A sanction severe enough to satisfy one strategic objective may still be softened, delayed, or selectively enforced if gasoline prices rise too far or allies come under strain. Another debate concerns the resource curse. Iran and Venezuela are often cited as examples of hydrocarbon wealth coexisting with underperformance and instability. That view emphasizes domestic governance failure, but another interpretation points more heavily to external constraints, financial exclusion, sanctions, technology denial, and punitive market access. Again, both matter. Large reserves do not rescue weak institutions, but weak institutions alone do not explain why countries with such vast resource bases can remain partially excluded from full market participation for long periods. There is also the question of de-dollarization and non-Western energy networks. Some see the growing role of China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in alternative trade channels as early evidence of a more multipolar order. Others note that the dollar-based system remains dominant in finance, insurance, benchmarking, and settlement, which means alternative networks still operate within constraints imposed by the larger system. So the future may be more fragmented, but not yet fully transformed. When viewed over time, several structural patterns become clear. First, reserve concentration matters even when production is low. A country does not need to be producing at maximum capacity to influence expectations about future supply. Second, the gap between reserves and realized output is one of the most important hidden variables in energy politics. Iran and Venezuela do not just sell oil. They represent withheld potential, whether by choice, constraint, or design. Third, sanctions do more than reduce supply. They reallocate opportunity. When Iranian and Venezuelan barrels are suppressed, other producers often gain market share, firmer prices, or both. Fourth, energy is also financial infrastructure. Exports depend on banking, insurance, classification, shipping, and legal channels. Restrict those, and you do not have to seize a field to reduce its output. Fifth, resource-rich states can still shape world order even while underperforming. Their significance lies not only in present output, but in their ability to alter the balance if political conditions change. That is what makes Iran and Venezuela enduring strategic variables. They are not fully inside the market and not fully outside it. They sit at the edge of supply, where diplomacy and geology meet. The energy importance of Iran and Venezuela is easy to misunderstand. They are often portrayed either as failed producers with exaggerated reputations or as dormant giants waiting to return. Both views miss the deeper point. Their importance lies in suspended capacity, in the fact that so much energy exists there but reaches the world only through a dense layer of politics, sanctions, infrastructure constraints, and great power rivalry. That suspended capacity changes how other states behave. It affects OPEC calculations. It shapes Chinese buying strategy. It influences Russian competition. It constrains US policymaking. And it gives every future crisis another variable to consider. Because in the modern energy system, power is not only the ability to produce, it is also the ability to decide which production remains delayed, discounted, redirected, or denied. Iran and Venezuela sit precisely in that zone, not merely as exporters, not merely as sanctioned states, but as reservoirs of possible supply inside a world that is constantly trying to manage scarcity, price, and influence at the same time. And that is why they continue to matter, even when so much of their oil is still waiting underground. If this video gave you a clearer way to understand the world beneath the surface, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more deep dives every week.